Hello, friends. Welcome to a presentation by Mr. Alper on punctuating dialogue, which I've titled "Shut Up," he explained, which is a quote from a story by an American writer named Ring Lardner. You don't need to know that, but it's kind of a joke because "shut up" isn't really an explanation, but it is an example of dialogue. So we're going to be looking today at how you punctuate dialogue in writing, which is used in both fiction writing as well as nonfiction writing. In modern writing, we indicate when characters are speaking, for the most part, by using quotation marks. Now, quotation marks have not always existed. People wrote for hundreds of years without feeling any great need to have marks that indicate when someone's talking. But once they were invented a few hundred years ago, people found them really useful. There's some contemporary writers, some writers today, who don't use them at all as just a matter of style choice. But as I said, most writers and especially most readers have found them really convenient. Using them according to the rules only makes sense, though, because if you don't follow the rules, then they can be even more confusing than if they're not there at all. So that's why understanding how they're used can, again, help the clarity of your own writing. So in general, the first rule we get a note about using quotation marks is that, and about punctuating dialogue in general, is that only the words that are spoken out loud are surrounded by the quotation marks at the beginning and at the end of the words that are spoken. Here's an example of some dialogue, something spoken by one character and another talking to each other, Fred and Mary, but with no quotation marks. "Fred, I want you to take that new truck back to the dealership." Mary snarled. "Right now?" "No way," Fred retorted. "Will you get me to return that truck?" You can probably figure out what is actually being said by Fred and Mary and what is part of the narration, what we call the dialogue cues, the words that indicate who is speaking. But it can be confusing. So we insert quotation marks, those sort of upside down pairs of commas, at the beginning and the end of each set of words that are spoken aloud. So the phrase "Mary snarled" is not part of what Mary said or snarled. Only the words "Fred, I want you to take that truck back to the dealership," and the words "right now" have quotation marks at the beginning and the end. And the same thing with Fred's rather rude response. Note that, by the way, in American writing, we use what we call double quotation marks. That is, like two commas. In the case of the opening ones, they're upside down commas, and at the end, they're right side up commas, but above the line. We call them double quotation marks. And then we're going to get to single quotation marks where there's only one comma shape. That's got a special use. In England, it's the other way around, though. They use single quotation marks at the beginning and ends of lines of dialogue. Second rule of using quotation marks and punctuating dialogue in general in American usage is to put commas and periods inside the quotation mark, even if they're not necessarily part of what's being spoken. So, for example, here the phrase, the sentence, "I do not know," insisted Albert. If you had "Albert insisted" before the sentence that he said, you'd put a comma before it to indicate. That's how we separate the dialogue cue from the sentence. So you put the comma there after the word "no." Even though the last thing Albert said was "no," if it was just a sentence standing by itself, you'd put a period there. But because the sentence is continuing to tell us "insisted Albert," we put a comma there. We put it in American style, we put the comma inside the quotation marks, like that, not outside. It's a minor thing if you did it wrong. Same thing at the end, where we put the period inside the quotation mark. If you had it the period after the quotation mark, I would never take points off for it. But for consistency's sake and for clarity, we put those punctuation marks inside the quotation mark. So in the following examples, as you can see, the first one is incorrect, and then it has the period after the quotation mark. It would go inside it. Third rule Some people seem to be under the impression that every sentence in a speech being spoken by a character, if they have multiple sentences, they should put quotation marks around them. I find every now and then a student does that, but you don't have to do that. Everything that Mary says, all those different short sentences, Mary exclaimed, "My mother was right, I never should have married you. You only ever think of yourself, and I'm always the one who has to suffer." That's all one speech by her, so just put quotation marks at the beginning and then at the end. Unlike here in Fred's response, which is punctuated incorrectly, "Oh, cry me a river. I'm the one who came out on the losing end of this marriage. Why didn't you listen to your mother?" Fred replied. All three of those sentences should be spoken by Fred, so you don't need those quotation marks there. So the first one's the correct one. Don't worry, by the end of this presentation, Fred and Mary are going to patch things up. Rule number 4. Each time a new speaker speaks, or the speaker changes, start a new paragraph. There are, again, some writers who prefer to just run all the dialogue together into one big paragraph, even if it's characters talking back and forth to each other. But, again, the rule emerged that starting a new paragraph every time a different character speaks helps the reader follow who is talking. First paragraph is Mary. Second paragraph is Fred's response. Third paragraph is her response to that. "You can be so cruel sometimes," Mary wailed. "Oh, I suppose you'll go crying to your mother now," Fred sighed. "At least she understands me," sobbed Mary. So we get a new paragraph for each of those changes of speaker. Rule number 5. In a dialogue that only involves two people, a lot of writers prefer not to have to keep saying, "said Fred, said Mary, said Fred, said Mary." It just kind of clutters it up, and the reader kind of ignores them anyway. So if you only have two people talking, after the first or second or third time somebody says something, you can usually just drop the dialogue cues, that he said, she said. "I understand how you feel, all right," said Fred. "You do?" asked Mary. You know I do," he said. "And you care about me?" If the reader is following, paying attention, they know that sentence, "and you care about me," must be Mary. "Of course I do." We can infer that must be what Fred said. So you don't need to keep saying, "he said, she said, he said, she said." "So you'll take the truck back?" That's Mary. "We'll talk about it," said Fred. So at least they're not yelling at each other anymore. Rule number 6. If you have a quotation inside a quotation, we switch. In American writing, we use single quotation marks for the quote inside a quote. That also includes other kinds of quotes like titles. We use quotation marks. In American use, we use a double set of quotation marks around titles of short works, like short stories. So if you are quoting what inside a line of dialogue, if a character quotes what somebody else said or quotes the title of a story, we put single quotation marks around it. We go back and forth between double and single. So in the first sentence, Rico said, Danae announced, "Do not treat me that way." So what Rico said is, Danae announced, "Do not treat me that way." But that includes inside it a quote by Danae. Danae said, "Do not treat me that way." So we put a single quote inside the double quote. It's also known as nested quotations. And in the second example, we have the substitute teacher talking, saying, "Everyone will read this short story tomorrow." And she includes the name, the title of the short story. Normally, we would punctuate that with double quotation marks. But because it's inside a sentence that already has double quotation marks, we alternate with single quotation marks. Again, this is kind of a technicality. If I correct it, just want to make sure you know why I might correct it on your writing. If you make a mistake with it, it's not usually a big deal, but sometimes it can be confusing if I can't tell where a quote begins or ends, especially if you have a quote inside a quote. The last two rules, 7 and 8, which are subdivided, they're even more kind of special cases. And again, if you make a mistake with it, not a big deal. Just want to, hopefully you'll understand why we might make this correction on your paper to make it clear. An exclamation point or a question mark, they get treated differently from periods and commas. They get placed inside the quotation marks if they're punctuating the phrase or sentence that is inside the quotation marks. But if it's a quotation inside a longer sentence, you put the exclamation point or the question mark at the end of the whole sentence. And I'll show you some examples that illustrate this more clearly. First sentence, I almost fell over when he asked, will that be a problem for you? The second one says, did the teacher really say finish by tomorrow? Now, in the first example, the person speaking said, I almost fell over, is saying something. He's not asking something. He's making a statement. He is quoting somebody else who asked a question, who asked, will that be a problem for you? So the question mark goes inside the quote because the sentence, will that be a problem for you, is a question. But the longer sentence, I almost fell over when he asked, is not. The second example is a question that has a statement inside it. Did the teacher really say finish by tomorrow? The sentence finish by tomorrow is not a question. But the whole sentence, did the teacher really say that, is a question. So we put the question mark outside the quotation mark to indicate, no, this part, finish by tomorrow, is not a question. The whole sentence is a question. And finally, another follow-up to number 7, also about exclamation points and question marks. If you put a question mark or an exclamation point at the end of a quote, even though that normally indicates the end of a sentence, if there's a dialogue cue or any more of the sentence that follows it after the question mark, punctuate it correctly as part of the larger sentence. This is a question that is part of a longer sentence. Did you hear Mr. Wood? That's a question, but it's part of the longer sentence. Asked Steve. Steve asked, did you hear Mr. Wood? So use a lowercase. Don't capitalize A. Same thing here. Watch out, warned John. Watch out is a complete sentence with an exclamation point. Normally we'd start with the capital letter at the beginning of the next sentence, but it's all part of a larger sentence. On the other hand, if the word that comes right after the exclamation point would be capitalized anyway, because it's a person's name, you would capitalize it. This last sentence is an example of what to do if the exclamation point is also the end of the whole sentence. John shouted, watch out. That's a complete sentence. So the next sentence is a separate sentence. He saw the pothole before I did, so you start that with a capital. Again, these are kind of technical issues, so if you get it wrong now and then, not a big deal, but they can help with clarity. They help your reader know when a sentence is ended, for example, even if it's got punctuation in the middle of it. So that's it. We got all 8 of those rules plus the sub-rules. So as you write your dialogue for your stories, punctuate with confidence, or at least maybe a little more clarity than you might have before. And as a thanks for watching this slideshow, you get to see a nice picture of my next to smallest dog, Cyrus. See you next time. Thanks for watching.